Von Karajan was a huge fan of trumpeter Louis Armstrong. And I can remember reading that Von Karajan said, "Oh, I'm going to my Louis Armstrong concert because he never loses a beat." Good day, my name is Stafford James. I'm a musician-composer. I primarily perform as a double bass soloist. I have a group that is a string ensemble, and I also have a 15-piece strings, percussion, and horns ensemble. To have been asked to do this interview was something which was a great pleasure for me, because for many years, not only was I composer at the German radio Westdeutscher Rundfunk, but I did numerous projects for Radio France, as well as radio in the American sector in Berlin, and had the most humble of encounters with Maestro von Karajan in 1976, when I was able to perform with the trumpet virtuoso Woody Shaw at the then brand new Berlin Philharmonic, and Maestro von Karajan was in attendance to this particular concert. One of the great pleasures of my life, due to the fact that when I was a student, during my student years, the Berlin Philharmonic was not the most preferred orchestra amongst the students at the conservatory that I went to. So we were a group of young rebels, so to speak, that carried around our Von Karajan or Berlin Philharmonic LPs and were able to listen by ourselves and were able to be super analytical to the recordings that we were listening to in that period in life. This influenced me immensely because Herbert von Karajan was a technician that knew about, above all, the tempo. He knew about the dynamics. He knew about how to move the piece, not just in the sense of notes, but in the sense of the overall melody of not just bar lines, but the whole continuum from beginning to end. And this is something that in other music forms that we learn to be able to interpret whether you have a dot over the note or whether you are aiming towards a sforzando in the notes, or whatever the melodic flow is in that particular instance musically. And these are the things that we learn from Von Karajan, his interpretation not only of musics like Beethoven, but his appreciation of ethno-music, such as I remember reading when he went to Cuba in 1949 that he was entranced by the music of the Cuban people, from the perspective that they could start playing and never once did they lose a beat. And this is something that I think gave Von Karajan, as in the continuum after Furtwängler, a sense of his direction musically to take the Berlin Philharmonic into the next time that they would become the great orchestra that they were, and for that matter still are. But during that time, Herbert von Karajan was that much of a personage for us as young musicians that we look to him not only from the perspective of his openness, of how he saw different musics as one, but how in turn he was able to take that openness and transform that to an orchestral sense. I was born in Evanston, Illinois. It's a northern suburb of the city of Chicago. I was a left-handed violinist at that age, at age 6, and at that time there was the stereotype of being left-handed, of which for a kid of that age, that was kind of harsh, I thought, because I was always put at the back of the orchestra because of being left-handed, and I thought that I played much better than the person that was in the front. Well, I decided at that juncture that the best thing for me to do was to learn how to play right-handed. So what happened is there was, I'll call it an intermezzo of sorts, because I had the opportunity to study with a very famous architect by the name of Barry Byrne that designed a number of buildings in the city of Chicago, as well as some of the great churches of the world in Cork Island, Ireland, for example, Christ the King Church. And I was his tracer for a number of years, from the age of 13 to when I graduated from high school. And he was the one that kind of made me feel okay about being left-handed. Then the whole musical journey comes back to where one day I heard a double bass. And the sound was so fascinating to me, I couldn't believe that I had missed out on all of this all of my life. But immediately I decided I want to do that. And so I started taking lessons, and lo and behold, I wound up years later with studying with bassist of the Chicago Symphony by the name of Rudolf Fassbinder, who was of German origin, and he was a very thorough teacher. And then after a couple of years with him, I decided I wanted to move to New York to study with Julius Levine of the New York Philharmonic. So I moved to New York, I studied with Julius Levine, and at the same time I started teaching at the United Nations International School. I was teaching the diplomats' children at the time, so it was a pretty good job being able to do that. And from there, this is when the saga began of finding lucrative work to, in essence, stay alive. Well, I have kind of a precarious situation from a career perspective that I went through, because when I was in my early 20s, about 22 or 23, and in conservatory, I had learned all of the music that I thought I needed to know to pass an audition for a specific orchestra at that time in the United States. But I was refused to even have a closed curtain. That put a bit of a trauma into my life, because I felt that I was prepared, but I should at least be given the chance to fail. But I was not given that opportunity to fail. But as Herbert von Karajan said, just as when he was working with the orchestra in Ulm in Germany, and the day came after working for a number of years with them, when he was making just penance, and he was holding everything together, they said, "You're fired." And so when you have this one door that closes, sometimes you have to wait for that other door to open. And in both of our cases, he got Aachen. And what happened in my life was, then all of a sudden, all of these pop players wanted my services. I started doing things like the first road tour of Hair, the Broadway show Hair. I worked with the comedian David Frost. I went to Las Vegas, to where I met Elvis Presley and Sammy Davis Jr. and these type of people, but that was never what I wanted to do. I wanted to play a certain way, but that did not afford me that opportunity at that particular juncture in life. Then what happened is I was doing a Mussorgsky concert, and this person, a famous individual by the name of Art Blakey, called me, and he had a very rough voice, and he said, "Come down and play with me. Will you come and play with me at the Village Gate in New York?" And I said, "Well, you know, I'll come after I have to do this Mussorgsky concert tonight." And, you know, all students had to do Night on Ball Mountain at that time. And so I said, "I'll come right after I finish." And he said, "Oh, you don't want to play with me?" And I said, "Oh, yes, I do, Mr. Blakey. I'd love to." And so I said, "But first I will do the concert with the school orchestra, and then I'll come afterwards." "Okay." So I went down, and after I had finished the concert, and I got my instrument out of its case, and all of a sudden the band started playing. I said, "Well, where are you?" And he said, "Turn to page 24. And so I turned to page 24 in the book, and I could hear where they were from the music, from the harmony that was being played, and I heard where they were, and so I came in, I started playing. Afterwards, he got up from his drum set, because he was a very famous drummer, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, anytime a bass player can come and read my music like that, then I want him in my band." And so I said, "Oh, okay." He says, "Do you have a passport?" And I said, "Well, no, Mr. Blakey, I can get one." He says, "Because we're going to Japan in 2 weeks, and I want you with me." So I went to Japan. I had to go back to ask the Dean of Students if I could go with this person, Art Blakey. And he said, "Oh, Art Blakey, he's quite famous. You might do good doing that." And so I went to Japan with Art Blakey, and we were there at the time for a month, and that was great. And then we came back and we toured all through the United States, and then we went to Canada, and then we went back to Japan, and it was like a whirlwind. And so after that, all of a sudden, I was getting calls from everyone under the sun to come and perform with them. But at the same time, you have to understand that my dream was to be an orchestral player. That was what I wanted. And so, ironically, as the years go by, I made some very famous recordings with certain individuals, and then all of a sudden I found myself doing a tour under the auspices of President Ronald Reagan at the time, and it was to Morocco and to Egypt and Sudan and Syria, India, and it was quite a tour throughout India and all over North Africa. It was really something, and President Reagan was sending some great communiques to us, asking us how we were, because it was very contentious times in the world, but we survived, and when we got back, things still were moving in a good direction. And then I got the opportunity I got a call and a commission to write contemporary music for Baroque instruments. And one of the instruments that I was composing for was the 14-string viola d'amore. And the concert that I had was firstly at the University of Texas in Austin at the Bates Recital Hall. And that recital hall is unique in that it adjusts to the number of players that are performing. In other words, if you're full orchestra, the ceiling comes up like that. And if you're a duet, the ceiling comes down like this, so that you're basically in a cone structure, acoustically conforming to the number of people that are performing. from there, that gave me the opportunity to go and perform in Stuttgart for the Europäisches Music Festival, and they featured my composition to end the festival. After all, the great composers that they had performed and written for that particular instrument, for viola d'amore. And as I stated, the one that I composed for was a 14-string viola d'amore. And I used basically the tuning that Bach used, but I changed one of the strings. Instead of the F sharp on top, I made it an F natural, just to have what jazz musicians call the sound of a sharp 9 chord. So that was how I gave my own little personality to this particular concept. And then from there, I started composing music for a string ensemble. And then I had dancers with the string ensemble. I had 10 contemporary dancers with the string ensemble. And this led to when I came to Vienna to study with Ludwig Streicher. And then Ludwig Streicher gave me the best advice. He says, you should compose music that is influenced by Brahms and influenced by Fritz Kreisler. And so I took that all to heart. And then after that period, which was Perestroika, when the Berlin Wall fell, that was when I got the call under the auspices of President George H.W. Bush, the father, to perform with the National Ukrainian Symphony, to do their first Western European tour. And that was their Stravinsky tour. So I performed with them, and from there, I was able to garner the position at the Westdeutscher Rundfunk, composing different projects for radio. And from there, my music was used in film in France. One film, in fact, with the French star Gérard Depardieu, to where it was utilized, called Le Grand Restaurant. So I had the fortune of doing all of those things before I decided that my wife and I would try Chicago at this juncture in life. And when I came to Chicago initially, they did a 2-hour program. The classical music station, the official classical music station of the Chicago Symphony and the New York Philharmonic, is the WFMT radio network. They did a 2-hour program on my life that was aired worldwide twice. And then from there, I was able to create the larger version of the string ensemble, the 15-piece ensemble of strings, percussion, and horns that consist of string quartet, harp, guitar. I'm the contrabass soloist. There's another bassist for the rhythmic aspect. There's 5 horns consisting of flute, bass, clarinet, trumpet, flugelhorn, trombone, and tuba. And then there's drums and percussion and guitar. So this, I produced a number of concerts for this, and then I was very fortunate that a record company by the name of Timeless Records International of the Netherlands has decided that they're going to release the CD of the Stafford James String Ensemble that was recorded live in Zurich and in Chicago, utilizing members from the Los Angeles Philharmonic to play the parts, and also the Hollywood film score musicians. And that was the part that was done in Zurich, and then the part that was done in Chicago was with members of the Chicago Sinfonietta. So this is the project that is due to be released soon, of which I am most honored and proud. I was mostly drawn to the clarity of the the LPs that we were listening to at that time sounded like nothing else that I had ever heard before. The Deutsche Grammophon recordings were, oh, they had a special sound to them that drew us to the clarity that we never had heard before on any of the even Columbia recordings that were in the United States at that time. And it was a special quality of sound that once you were analyzing the music with the score and hearing it, you could see his interpretation or hear it even more clearly. You saw it in the scores, because in that time we carried around all of the mini scores and things such as this, and you could see and hear the interpretation simultaneously. He has influenced my musical habits through interpretation of flow, through the interpretation of the dynamic of a particular piece, because not every piece, just because you see a row of quarter notes, doesn't mean that every quarter note is the same. It has its own interpretation due to the melodic flow of any given piece. Therefore, you may have these notes, but that doesn't mean that every note weighs the same. The interpretation of those notes becomes different regardless of the musical genre that you're performing in. And this is, in my years of working with the radio, this is how I was able to take this and be able to incorporate this into my compositions, that this is how I wanted to interpret the particular composition that I was focusing on at that given time. And I had the opportunity to compose a lot for various radios, and when your music is being utilized for radio themes or for whatever the purpose is, you have to think of what is the dynamic of the music, what are you trying to achieve in the overall goal? Because the notes are there, yes, but the sensibility of each of those notes is something that is to be discovered. To give you an example, you may have a dotted quarter note and followed by an eighth note, and sometimes you'll have a musician play them as two quarter notes, and it doesn't give you the same feeling that, of course, that a dotted quarter note and the eighth note gives, but sometimes you can utilize that eighth note as though it has a dot over it, and it might become a little bit shorter in its interpretation of where it is going. And this is what we learned from von Karajan, is that if he were to make a pause after a certain phrase, the time within the time signature and the tempo never fluctuated. It was still the same. But the interpretation of that given passage through the notation was one thing, but through execution and the melodic tendencies to where it was going, that was something else. When I worked with the trumpeter Woody Shaw, he was a virtuoso of a trumpet player, and this is known worldwide that he was an excellent musician. He had this, he never said it, never stated it, but he had this mindset that of flow and the timbre of the music, to where the notes were written one way, but how we interpreted them was realistically through how the sentence was being stated, how the sentence of the notes was being stated. And when you state something that may die at the end of that phrase, so must the note. The note does not just go straight on. It goes with the phrasing of where is the sentence leading us in the whole dialogue of the music. Where are we going? And this is something that was inherent in Herbert von Karajan's way of thinking, to my mind. How the two worlds intertwine between orchestral music and small group music, meaning jazz music, is very interesting because there are a number of similarities, and von Karajan was a huge fan of trumpeter Louis Armstrong. And I can remember reading that von Karajan said, "Oh, I'm going to my Louis Armstrong concert because he never loses a beat. I can listen to Louis Armstrong for 2 hours and I know that the tempo will always remain the same." And this, in conjunction with his 1949 visit to Cuba, Argentina, and Chile, when he saw the Cuban musicians, as von Karajan put it, they would come out at noon and they wouldn't finish performing until 5. But believe me, they never lost a beat. And what impressed me the most was seeing that the little kids would come from their homes and just immediately take part in the rhythmic side of what was being played. And so I think that this in turn added to how he perceived tempi, or a specific tempo, how he perceived the linear part of notation, not in bar lines, but in overall structure of beginning to the end of a melodic line. This happens in jazz music quite frequently, to where, for example, the phrase may go beyond the bar line. The bar line will say, "This is the end," but the phrasing may take it over that particular marking. And many times you will hear from a different orchestral perspective that there is a pause here, then there's the articulation of this particular notation here. It may extend over in this part into the next bar, or there's so many similarities in interpretation of what actual music becomes, and what music becomes in its overall articulation is the thematic material that gets us from A to B, and do we communicate with you, the listener. This is the most important aspect of any music, whether it's operatic, whether it's only dealing with instruments. We want to hear that, for example, that Pavarotti hits this note and that he does something that touches us emotionally. And it is the same thing when we hear how von Karajan may interpret that great recording that he did of the Sibelius Violin Concerto, which was one of my favorites. How the Berlin Philharmonic performed on that and got underneath the soloist and brought the soloist out. I listen to this constantly because it's one of my favorite pieces. And I also just received from the Institute a marvelous recording of the Staatskapelle performing Shostakovich's 10th Symphony. And this was something that was very special for me. And this is how I look at musics. I may be known in many books as this type of musician, but to my mind, a musician is supposed to be someone that is eclectic enough in his thought processes that he understands that musics are wider than just one genre. Musics are the ocean of understanding that we as musicians must partake upon. When I had the opportunity to study with the famed bassist of the Vienna Philharmonic by the name of Ludwig Streicher, one of the things that he pointed out to me was, he said, "You know, Brahms used to like to play in cabarets." He really enjoyed this, and so did Fritz Kreisler. They loved to play in cabarets, and this came out in their sense of music. And when you think in the terms of what we call in the present day terms jazz music, this was only just a music that was the music of the people throughout the times. We call it something now as a name, but everything borrowed from each other. As far as when you listen to Brahms's Hungarian dances, you hear the folkloric sense of the people that comes through in the music. Some may say, well, this is in a way a certain jazzness or jazziness, because jazz music is about the people too. And the interpretation that I heard the Vienna Philharmonic play was one that was really truly wonderful, that you feel that this is folk music at its best. The same way that I listen to the music of Bela Bartok. I listen to that music in the same way. Or when I listen to the music of Maurice Ravel or Debussy, I listen to that in the same way from a harmonic standpoint and a melodic standpoint. And when I think about the music of Brahms, that he was the type of personage that he was eccentric in his own ways. And that comes through in how he composed music. And I think one of the great lines that I remember is the wife of Strauss said to Brahms, "What do you regret most?" And Brahms said, "Well, I regret that I didn't write Blue Danube." And so when you listen to something like Blue Danube, you think this is a great work, but when you put it in the hands of a personage like Brahms, I would have heard that from a different perspective, if you see what I'm alluding to here. Because the type of individual that I assume that he was, I only know through my readings, but I get the sense that Brahms was very much like what I would like to think of an eccentric musician, or one that had his own way about things. And when we look at the ties between the musics, we look at something like, for example, this great group that was a jazz group. It was called the Modern Jazz Quartet. And one of their most famous compositions was entitled Django. Now, where does Django come from? Well, Django actually comes from Bach's English suites. That's where that melody comes from. So there is already a link between how you utilize an idiom versus another idiom that you're dealing with, whether it's jazz music, whether it's called orchestral music, or as Duke Ellington once said, classical music is music that has lasting value. When I think about the things in the tradition of an orchestra, a great orchestra such as the Berlin Philharmonic and its origins, and I think about when it started, I think it was 1882 that the Berlin Philharmonic came into existence, and at that time it was Hans von Bülow who was the first conductor with the Berlin Philharmonic. And as I recall, he had a very strong link to the music of Wagner. Then, after that period with Artur Nikisch, that was another period in the development of the orchestra, because he had the opportunity to record, and that was a big thing for the Berlin Philharmonic to have the ability to record music so that the public could actually hear that in another medium. And now this leads us to the big kind of war between Furtwängler and von Karajan. Where does this take us from a musical perspective of style? What does one style, does it inhibit one on one side? Because both took their criticisms. and there were moments when they were at odds, but it still took the orchestra in the sense of we are still moving forward as an orchestra, as an ensemble. And I think that from this perspective, just as I had read that Herbert von Karajan had the opportunity to possibly be the conductor with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. And as we're here in Chicago, we know that Chicago is known for its great orchestral prowess. So from that perspective, I had the opportunity to speak with a longtime principal bassist with the orchestra. His name is Joseph Gustafesta. And Joseph Gustafesta, I asked him, I said, what was the overall analogy as to how did they feel that von Karajan would fit into the orchestra? Was there kind of like a proxy vote, who was in, who was out, who thought of this, who thought of that? And he told me there was a vote, but because of von Karajan's prior affiliations during World War II, that they felt that it would not be the best for Chicago to have von Karajan. Well, then he told me, but we all said, us as musicians, we really wanted him because we thought that von Karajan was the genius that Chicago needed at that time. And that touched me because it showed that concept had arrived from a different perspective of all of the great conductors that had conducted in Chicago, but a new concept had arrived in that of Herbert von Karajan that the musicians did, at least, even though many were at odds, they did take a vote on that. And that impressed me because the next conductor that was in that tradition was Sir George Solti, because he and von Karajan were very close in certain ways, musically. And I think of any orchestra that goes in its tradition and takes the consensus of the musicians, that is a democratic orchestra, and I like that. Just as when in 1955, when von Karajan, it was stated that von Karajan would be composer for life for the Berlin Philharmonic. That was the consensus that the musicians had come to, because it was a vote that had to take place, and this was something great for music. It showed the democracy of giving the musicians a voice also. And I like that very much. As the musician, I was fascinated by his interpretations the moment that I heard him. As a business mind, I see that he did so much for the orchestra, understanding that it was Herbert von Karajan that realistically took us into the digital age. And when we understand that his premise for all of this was so that the world would be able to hear orchestral music, it would be more accessible to the public, because now we have this, instead of a big recording disc, now we have this little thing we call a compact disc. And this made it so that the wider public hopefully would be able to access more of the music from this new fascination. So that, from a business perspective, is phenomenal. Also, from his lifestyle perspective, we all love all of our stars in how they are when they're. We basically, I think, just as there was a Miles Davis that drove his fast sports cars, so did Herbert von Karajan. He always drove his Porsche, or he did this, or when he was with his big cars, his Rolls Royce or whatever. This fascination kind of seeps into the actual persona of what the individual is that makes the music that he makes, because you must live that life in order to project that particular lifestyle. And I think that he lived what he actually was. He had a sense of, when you think of like how Toscanini was able to, he was often criticized for his tempi being too fast, but he stood steadfast in his conducting skills, and this influenced also Herbert von Karajan to where he was steadfast. He had memorized, just as Nitish did, who was one of the first that did everything from memory. Herbert von Karajan was also one that, as the naysayers would say, he kept his eyes closed, but he internalized the musics. And when you internalize the music, that means that indeed the inflections of, you're not just counting beats with your hand, you're interpreting this through gesture. And that gesture that is picked up, this becomes part of the persona that we, at least from my perspective, I have to say from my perspective that this is what made me feel that Herbert von Karajan was on a mission. And I like that. Herbert von Karajan has left an influence on orchestral playing that is more than an indelible mark. I think that he and his way of procedure will live long into the future. I'm quite sure that what he has done, just as all artists will have their critics, but criticism is in the eye of the beholder, because there will be many that will have appreciated all of what Herbert von Karajan tried to do for all of us, not just from a self perspective, but from the perspective of musics. And musics, in the plural sense, is what Herbert von Karajan was about. He was one that could appreciate, just as he appreciated my playing in a different genre altogether, he appreciates music from multiple genres, and this went into his way of thinking about musics. And I will always be most appreciative to have had the maestro at least hear what I have tried to do in my most humble of ways as an artist, because I feel that as a musician it has humbled me to be most thankful for everything that I have been able to do in these years of being a musician. I have been blessed with the good fortune to have not only have been inspired by great individuals such as Herbert von Karajan, but I've been blessed and thankful to have been able to perform on a high level with the number of great musicians that I've had the opportunity to perform with. And to this, I say thank you for the inspiration of Herbert von Karajan that made us try to be the best that we could possibly be, and more.